This presentation is about Tucson Unified School District's Title I services to eligible private school students and schools. My name is Lynn Strizich, and thank you for joining me. I want to first talk about what the intent of Title I services are. The intent of Title I services are to improve academic outcomes for eligible students. This training provides nuts and bolts information to private schools about how you're allocated Title I resources, how you may identify students who are eligible for a Title I program, and some basic information that is necessary to operate a Title I program. So basically, what you need to know is that Title I service dollars to private schools is developed using a flat per pupil allocation. Every year in the January, we gather information from private schools regarding the number of students at their site, K-12 students, who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. So we use that information to input into our application so that these students become funded. We use that overarching flat per pupil allocation for private schools to get an allocation. From that allocation for private schools, we also are able then to allocate different costs and come up with an adjusted per pupil. So one of the things that we do is we have an indirect rate that changes every year. That indirect rate covers things like human resources, our finance office, and those kinds of things, just the cost of doing business. Then we also have direct costs that can be directly traced to administering private school programs, and that's going to be things like salaries for the private school staff. And in the case of Tucson Unified School District, it's a portion of salaries because we also administer other federal programs to private schools, and those costs are split amongst the different federal funding streams. One of the things that I do want to talk about in particular this year is that there are some costs that previously were part of our direct admin costs that we moved to a site-based cost, and this was based on ADE direction. So every school is charged a per pupil charge based on the use of Title I funding for program assessment, program supplies, and instructional aids that we have either in our resource center or that we purchase to administer private school Title I programs. Every site that uses or runs a Title I program during the year will pay a share of those overarching costs, and it will be based on the number of students that were funded at your site. The other thing I think that's really important to know is making sure that schools know that funds follow students and families and are always 1 year behind the current school year demographics. So when we gather data in January, that data is used to fund students for the following July through June. Here is some information that was sent out in your allocation letter about how the total TUSD Title I allocation is derived, what it is, what the private school share is. It talks here about the direct costs, the indirect, and the adjusted allocable to private schools. The other thing I want to talk about is that this year we did not take a professional development set aside because I was finding that it was so unevenly used and not really a good value for probably 95% of the private schools that I work with, and it's not a requirement. So rather than taking a professional development set aside, we left that money in the grant, which increased the per pupil allocation going down to schools for tutoring services. We still have a family engagement set aside that is required. Preliminary allocations are estimates, but should be very close to final allocations. Private schools should make plans for the use of 100% of their current known allocation. Family engagement set aside should also be part of the planning and also be planned for, and I will talk a little later about how we can use those. The other thing that I want to make sure schools understand is that if they have a desire or a preference to use a tutoring vendor rather than a directly hired TUSD employee, that is part of consultation. We will give consideration to site wishes, but at the end of the day, it really is the district that makes that decision because it's a district program. Sometimes we are forced to use vendors because we simply cannot staff the program the way it is designed, or because there aren't enough tutors available. In any case, it's really important that if you are contacted by a vendor, you make sure they contact the district office to understand the protocols in place for working with vendors. Avoid any appearance of impropriety in your relationships with vendors. Vendors are not to set up tutoring schedules or select students. Private schools are targeted assistance programs for the purposes of Title I services. So what are those key features? Well, first of all, students have to be eligible. Eligible students must live in a Title I homeschool attendance area and must be in a district with whom the private school is participating in Title I services. Expenditures must be allowable and allocable. Services must still be supplemental based on a valid data-driven needs assessment. The program is controlled by the district. The district is responsible for retaining control of the funds and providing program services. And this is why final decisions rest with the district. Families must be made aware that students are participating in a public school Title I program. Students enrolled in a Title I program must have a signed permission form on file. Email copies of forms to privateschools@tusd1.org. We also require program assessment and evaluation that is directly related to student achievement. One of the questions that has been coming in the last couple of years is how does the idea of a well-rounded education impact Title I services in private schools? And that is a complicated question. We need to remember that for the purposes of Title I, the priority is academic achievement. Therefore, if a school really feels that counseling services are needed as part of their Title I program, these services would only be for targeted eligible students, and that means the students that are actually enrolled in the tutoring program, not just students who would be eligible to be in a tutoring program. And the priority is academic counseling, not socio-emotional. So how do private schools access Title I schools? So remember that I said schools receive service allocations based on low-income students. Every year, the schools are asked to provide a list of free reduced eligible students along with their home information. We take those lists and vet those pieces of information against whether or not students live in a Title I attendance area. Students who qualify in both poverty and homeschool residence requirements are then funded. Those students do not have to be the same students who receive Title I program services. To receive program services, students must reside in a Title I attendance area of a sponsoring district. So what that means is a student who generated funding for your Title I program may not be the same student who needs to receive services. The only requirement for both sides of this equation are that the students come from a Title I homeschool attendance area. Private schools then need to provide academic data about prospective Title I students so that districts can rank or prioritize students in order of academic need. Targeted assistance programs must serve students in order of academic need. In order to provide that prioritization, standardized assessment data must be used for students grades K-12. And I want to take this opportunity to remind you that we do not serve students outside the K-12. Teacher recommendations may be used as a small part of the student selection process. One of the things you might be wondering is, I thought that K-2 students did not need to use standardized assessment data, that we could use teacher recommendation only. That used to be true. For the last 2 years, that is no longer true. Arizona Department of Ed is really looking for academic assessment data. Once we have determined what the assessment data is, and based on the program design that has been agreed upon by the district and the private school, it's really the responsibility of the district to select the students to be served. We obviously in TUSD want to consider site program design and teacher input, but again, teacher recommendations may only be used as a small part and not the largest part during student selection. I also want to point out and remind you that, like I said earlier, TUSD is not holding a professional development set aside in Title I, and family engagement funds that are part of the set aside and are part of a per pupil site allocation are to engage and service families of Title I students only. And in this case, just like the counseling, it's only to engage and service families of students who are actually receiving Title I tutoring services. The next topic I want to talk about is about program design. Tucson Unified School District really honors the needs of individual private schools and students at those private schools by asking the private schools to provide us the biggest pieces of the program design. Once you have given us this program design, we work really hard to staff the program design in the way that fits the needs of your school and your students. But let's talk about what is contained in a program design. What is meant by that? Well, one thing is meant is where are services going to take place? Almost 100% of the time, that happens at the private school that the student is enrolled. When and how? So when will services begin and end? What time of the year? What is the actual day-to-day schedule? Remember that we need to know by grade level and content what is the student schedule that you are proposing. Tutors must meet Arizona state certification requirements, so that can vary based on grade level. We need finalized tutoring schedules at least 45 days prior to a proposed commencement of tutoring services. And to improve program staffing, I ask you to schedule all tutoring at a minimum of a 4-hour block without any breaks. Some schools, because of space and other constraints, really want to have just an after-school program. After-school programs are typically best and most easily staffed by private school teachers who already work at that site and who are also employed by Tucson Unified School District for off-contract tutoring time. All services must be received by June 30, 2022. So which students are given Title I services? Students placed in the academic need ranking that was discussed earlier does determine which students should receive tutoring. I want to point out at this time that it is not okay to exempt whole groups of students. That typically happens more with special education students. It is against the law, it is a civil rights issue, and we must make sure that special education students receive all the services that they would be entitled to. Now, programs do allow for exemptions of students in the rank order, but it has to be an educationally sound programmatic reason. If you have that need, please contact me and we can discuss this. The other thing to remember is that students must have signed permission forms in place before tutoring begins. That would actually be a reason why a student is exempted. If a parent refuses to sign a permission form, then we may skip that student in provision of ranked services. The other thing I want you to consider is a scheduled date for parent orientation to the Title I program. Remember earlier when I told you that we would discuss family engagement funding and how it can be used? This is an example of how family engagement funding could be used. Maybe your school has an open house. So maybe as part of the open house, you can have your Title I teachers have special sessions with parents, and we could pay the TUSD employed staff to provide that time to meet with parents. Likewise, we can also pay staff out of that set aside for counseling or conferencing with the families of Title I students who actually are receiving student services. What does the needs assessment data reveal about student needs? So it's important that when you provide academic data that you provide it for all the grades your school has, because really what they want us to do is rank students across the school, and we really have to look at all grade levels in order to determine if the program design is appropriate and meeting student needs. Then finally, how does the school prefer the program be staffed? And we will ask you whether you prefer TUSD employed tutors or vendors. And I want to remind you, do not contact vendors directly. TUSD retains final determination of how tutoring programs are staffed. The other consideration is the cost. TUSD employed tutors will cost roughly 50% of what vendor tutors cost. Having said that, I want to remind you that sometimes we are not able to staff programs with TUSD employed tutors, in which case we are in the business of providing services to students and we will use a vendor. Well, it may go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. It is really important in the current year to remember that COVID-19 remains present in our program landscape. It is important to remember that all federal activities managed by Tucson Unified School District follow Tucson Unified School District guidance, and whatever rules are in place at that pertinent time. So, for example, if a mask mandate is in place for Tucson Unified School District staff and students, the same will be true for Tucson Unified School District program services at private school sites. So regardless of the private school's current mask or not mask mandate, if a mask mandate is in place for Tucson Unified School District, then private school students would be required to wear masks during the provision of services being funded through Tucson Unified School District. If you have other questions, we are certainly available to consult. You may reach us at privateschools@tusd1.org. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I look forward to working with you. Again, this is Lynn Strizich with Tucson Unified School District, Equitable Services Program Coordinator. Thank you.